That's a good boy. That's my good boy. Yes. That's my silly boy. Come on, look. Get it. Yes. Here's my boy. Get it, get it, get it. Get it, get it, get it. Yeah. Get it, get it. Get it, get it. That's a good boy. That's a good boy. Yes, yes. That's my good boy. What's she got? What is that? Yeah. How I got into it was because my life hit the skids, and I was very depressed, actually suicidal at the time. My health had gotten really bad. I couldn't work anymore, and I thought, so what am I going to do with my life? You know, I didn't know what I was going to do with my life, and I thought, well, until I figure out what I'll do, I'll just go to the animal shelter and walk a couple dogs. 7 years later, here I am walking a couple dogs and teaching the pet responsibility program, and currently in school to become a canine behaviorist. And yeah, it changed my life. They absolutely changed my life. Predominantly, I spend a lot of my time here at the shelter, because this is really, for animals, the bottom of the barrel. This is the last stop, and it's where you're going to feel the greatest loss, but it's also where you're going to see the greatest contributions. You know, a lot of animals don't make it. We just had 2 that I lost last week that I've worked with for months, and that's hard. But then, you know, having a dog adopted, seeing a dog go to a new home, keeping up with them because people send pictures of their dogs, that's fabulous to know that there was this animal that someone considered so worthless and now has this wonderful life.
I first started volunteering at animal shelter soon after college, when I was living out in Palo Alto, California. And I've always loved animals, but I think one of the reasons I got involved with animal advocacy was actually because of my strong environmental roots and kind of the belief that humans aren't all there is. So, and animal shelters are just kind of like the most concrete way, at least in the U.S., to get involved with, you know, animal work. I also became a wildlife rehabber and rehabbed songbirds and things like that. So, but now most of my animal work does take place in the shelter.
My involvement is largely volunteering with the dog rescue that I work with. And I'm unfortunately not a foster, but I've gotten to see up close and personal what fosters can do within the system. The rescue I work with, Hope Animal Rescue, is not a location, but it's a network of fosters. Mm-hmm. So even that, I suppose you could see as feminist, and then it's not hierarchical or institutional, but very much a web of networks. And the fosters obviously take in the dogs, but they tend to get them from the shelters. So the fosters will go on weekends or to whatever shelters are getting full and pull animals. And as soon as you pull an animal, you can not only start to hopefully get it ready to be homed, but you can make space for another animal in a shelter. So I'm really grateful that I've gotten to do that work. The other thing, though, is I give a lot of money to causes around largely that are against factory farming. I don't know as yet how I can volunteer to do something like that. I'm totally on board with the idea, and maybe sabbatical will allow me to visit one of the farm sanctuaries. But I came to the realization in 2011 when I read Eating Animals by Jonathan Safran Foer, which was a summer reading book for UNC Chapel Hill, where I was teaching at the time. And I came to the realization that factory farming is one of the greatest evils of the modern world. And I don't know how to change that aside from changing my own individual choices and throwing money at those organizations that have some sort of larger networks. But that is a problem that is so systemic that my choice or your choice, unfortunately, is not going to change anything. But that is something that I hope, maybe even through teaching, that I sort of plant seeds in student minds about how this is a real issue.
I was always drawn to animals as a kid, especially dogs. And I think that they made me feel psychologically safe in a way that I didn't with most other children, because kids could be mean and scary in ways that animals usually weren't. And stories and images of animal suffering were always really disturbing to me. So when I was in about 3rd or 4th grade, I stopped eating meat. But besides being vegetarian, I didn't do much in the way of animal advocacy until after I finished college and moved to North Carolina. And I started by volunteering in a couple of animal shelters, but what really got me motivated was discovering what are known as outdoor dogs. So I grew up in Chicago, where dogs necessarily lived indoors because people didn't have backyards to put them in. So when I moved to North Carolina and people would ask me if I had an indoor or an outdoor dog, I had no idea what they were talking about. But then I started noticing these animals that lived full-time in little outdoor pens or on chains in people's backyards. So you'd see them outside by themselves in the rain and in the bitterest winter weather. And discovering these companion animals that were living their lives basically in solitary confinement completely freaked me out. And when I stumbled across a humane education program for 4th graders that was developed in Moore County, North Carolina, I was like, we need that here. So I've been running the Pet Responsibility Program for 5 years now, and we started with one school in 2013, and this year we're planning to visit 14 schools. And the program consists of a series of 6 lessons that cover everything from the basic needs of animals to the importance of preventing pet overpopulation by spaying and neutering pets. We talk about a variety of health and safety issues, talk about the cost of caring for an animal, and we talk about things that kids can do to be advocates for animals just within their own families or neighborhoods. We ask our students to talk with their families about what they've learned and take the information home to their families, explaining all the low-cost services that are available for pet owners in Guilford County. I hope that the Pet Responsibility Program will give kids an opportunity to think about animals as individuals with needs that are similar to their own. If they're able to encourage their families to make some improvements in the way that they care for animals, that's wonderful. But if not, I hope that students will at least give some thought to what things they might like to do differently in their families if they decide to adopt a pet when they get older.
I think the Pet Responsibility Program is wonderful. The bumper sticker for it is Teach Humanity, which is teaching that. It's teaching compassion. It's talking to children about empathy, which, if you can get them to understand empathy for animals, for other kids, for just differences in life, then it's helping to undo some of that structure, because I can't hate you, I can't hurt you if I understand you.
I got involved in more sort of direct, I guess, advocacy work here through the Pet Responsibility Program. I had heard about it, I think I saw it on Facebook or something, that somebody mentioned they were looking for more educators, and I just thought it sounded great, because everything you know about all the social problems that contribute to animal overpopulation and abuse and neglect they have multiple sources, but education is a big part of that. And a big part of the curriculum was about teaching and stretching empathy. If you've never been taught to consider the feelings of a non-human, then you're not going to have a lot of practice at it. So trying to catch them young and realizing it doesn't have to be this sad, it can be better, made a lot of sense to me.
When the kids write their Scooter Bowl contest, some of the things that they write in there, you start seeing where they're getting it with the compassion. They're reaching out, not just to the animals, but to the community, wanting to help. And it's wonderful just to see that growth after just, at that point, 5 weeks when you get it.
It's weird because I started realizing that kids are probably the best way to kind of nudge that conversation along, because the kids that we see in any kid can relate to being bossed around by a grown-up who is unjustly using their power. Real or perceived. I think kids have that sense. Every kid knows what it's like to be bossed around by somebody in a way that feels really unfair to them. What I learned, I started learning about humane research on dog training and canine psychology and just general learning theory. Kind of broke my brain open in a really good way. I had always only trained my dogs with positive reinforcement. I did use non-reinforcing markers, which might be like a no or an but not, I never followed it up with a punch. I was always trying to be what I would now call force-free, even though I'm not now, even though I wasn't then. Now I am, as I sort of learned more about force-free handling, I realized that there's actually a lot that we do to animals all the time that's coercive, even when we're not setting out to be coercive. Even something as simple as putting on a leash and walking a dog can be coercive and aversive to the dog in the right setting, depending on how the dog is reacting to it. It also kind of dovetailed with a lot of what I was learning about attachment theory in regards to how you apply that in parenting. I have a 6-year-old. So around the same time, several years back, I was sort of learning how to be a human, because it turns out society doesn't really teach us that. They teach us a lot of things, but they don't really teach us how to treat other living things with fundamental respect if we have physical power over them. I think that's a fundamental problem in society, and I think you see it in early childhood education, or possibly education all the way through of children. I think you see it in how we treat our animals as a society, how a lot of the problems that we see with domestic violence come from failing to treat somebody else with the full measure of respect that living things deserve. We think that because we can force a 2-year-old into a car seat that doesn't want to get in a car seat, that it's okay to do that, and it's not. There are situations where yes, you have to get out of the street so you don't get run over, and I'm not talking about those. Those situations in life, as they apply to children, as they apply to dogs, as they apply in interpersonal, intimate relationships, are very, very few. But we do that all the time. There are seldom good reasons why you need to force yourself on that animal right then. And that's also really true when you're parenting small children or watching out for small children. Small children have a lot of needs, they have a lot of feelings, they usually don't agree with yours. But there's seldom, when you're at a lot of things you ask yourself when you're trying to parent a 3-year-old in a peaceful manner is, okay, she doesn't want to sit down now, do we have to sit down? Would giving her 2 minutes help this along? And lots of times it's, do you want to sit down now, or do you want to sit down in 2 minutes? And if I'm trying to look for parallels in the animal world, and there are times when I do just have to kind of move them along for safety. I can't let a dog stand and try to get it and do it with another dog, because nothing good's gonna come from that. But if I can wait for a couple of minutes and see if I can get the dog to come voluntarily on the leash when he's stopped, instead of just yanking him along, I'm gonna do it every time I possibly can. There isn't any reason not to. There's seldom a reason to coerce, I think. I'm really huge about consent, and you can get a dog's consent. You can get a cat's consent. You have to know what you're looking for. You have to know how to communicate with them, but it is fundamental, just in the same way that my daughter is not going to be required to hug or kiss or any of that to any relative this holiday season that she doesn't want to. We offer alternatives. Oh, okay, you don't want to hug Uncle Jerry, do you want to give him a high five? And if the answer is no, that's fine. It's always been fine, and I will go to the mat for somebody that tries to force themselves on a kid. People also force themselves on animals, and unfortunately, sometimes the animal doesn't know what else to do but bite. And even though that wasn't that animal's fault, that's how they end up here, and a lot of those dogs don't ever come back. And it doesn't have to be like that.
You know, we're flooded with animals right now. We're absolutely flooded, which is why we're having the sale that's going on right now. And the reason we're flooded with animals is because it's the holiday season. And didn't know what to do with their animals, so they dumped them.
Yeah, I think the vulnerability of non-human animals intensifies our obligation to them as Homo sapiens. And animals give us so much. And I'm not even just talking about food, but that's a major issue. If animals are going to give their lives for us to eat them, which is in itself an intellectual and personal debate, we should give them the best lives possible. And that is not happening under the current factory farm system, so that's a problem. Then when you think about species like dogs that have been domesticated such that they are intertwined with humans, like their very existence by and large for domesticated dogs depends on some sort of communication from humans. They don't deserve to be dumped at shelters when they're sick and old. They don't deserve to be thrown on highways. They don't deserve to be kicked in a domestic dispute. So all of these are just, I think, really pressing issues for us as humans and how we relate to one another and how we relate to the world around us.
I guess silence is what comes to mind when I think about the relationship between the mistreatment of animals and the mistreatment of women. Abused animals can't tell anybody what's happening to them, and abused women and children are often threatened with shame or violence in order to keep them quiet. I've been really fortunate not to experience much in the way of gender-based mistreatment as an adult, but I did experience some gender-based bullying by an older friend when I was growing up. And one of the worst things about it was feeling too ashamed to tell anyone what was going on. I'm not sure if that experience affected my life, but I'm especially upset by cases of human and animal abuse where the victims aren't able to communicate the harm that's being done to them.
The first abuse case for children came through the Humane Society, and they had to talk about the children as if they were animals to prove that they were abused, and that was how the first child abuse laws were passed, thanks to the Humane Society.
I always hear the stories of domestic abuse victims and how oftentimes there's so many reasons they'd be unwilling to leave an abuser, but children and pets are often a big part of that, because someone who's being abused by, again, often a male partner, not always, but a lot, a male partner, is also worried about those other lives. And we also know that oftentimes animals are victims of domestic abuse also. So I think that's just one of those pretty routine examples of cruelty that animals and women simultaneously face.
I think there's so much coercion of women in society that we don't even realize we're being coerced. I mean, there's so much preemptive, internalized accommodation, I think, of these larger norms. You know, I think about things like, I mean, how many times have you told some guy at a bar that's too close some lies to make him go away?
Raping your wife is, you know, that concept even being talked about is so new. You know, some of the things that people do to children. You know, I was a teacher for years, and I've seen kids come in with a burn mark from a curling iron. The boys with short hair dug his curling irons. So it was pretty obvious where it came from. And now here with the animals, you see the abuse, you see the neglect. And it's infuriating. It's absolutely infuriating. Just the devaluing of animals and the devaluing of women are so interconnected.
I don't know a woman that has not been coerced or touched or made to act against her will. I don't know one. And while I'm not always sort of consciously aware of that when I'm working with animals, I know how awful it is. I know how awful it feels to not have, to know that you don't have a good choice. That you don't have a good choice. That your best choice of getting out in the biggest peace possible is pretty terrible. And I do carry that with me because I don't want to make anything feel like that. I know no living thing. And I certainly wouldn't do it unless I had a really damn good reason. I don't think most men who do it have any good reasons at all.
I look at the religions of the book, meaning Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and the story of the beginning of humanity, where you had Adam on top, and then Eve was his helper. She was to do whatever he thought best, and she turned out to be, the terrible person who believed, the snake and the whole shtick with the apple and all of that. And then Adam also had dominion over the animals. And there has been this whole school of thought since then that men hold dominion over all other living creatures of the earth. And that includes women and animals. And when you have abusive personalities, it's going to show up a lot of times to their spouses, to their children, and to their dogs.
In terms of what connects animals and women, in terms of those vulnerabilities, I think about the first 2 chapters of Genesis. And I think about how dominion theology emerged out of that, with the sense that God has given humans this world to take and to use. That coming out of sort of like this relationship between God and humans. This is what God has given. And then in the second Genesis story, we see the punishment for the transgression in the garden being that women will desire her husband and be subordinate to him. And there's just in these early chapters of the Bible, the sense that there's hierarchy and structure, and how animals and women fit into that differently than men, is immediately there if you're looking for it. Now, I think one of the things that's interesting is my understanding is, I'd have to revisit this, but I don't think anywhere in these early stories does God say, go eat all this meat that I've given for you. I mean, it seems to be a vegetarian Eden, and even after the fall, I don't see them talking about meat eating until later on in Genesis. So what exactly does dominion theology mean versus what it's been taken to mean? So that connection is there immediately, but even more so than what's in the text is how it's been deployed over the course of centuries and millennia. So you have this dominion theology, and then you get a response from traditions like Catholicism that I can speak to, doing Catholic studies, but also being raised Catholic, is the stewardship of the earth. It's not that God has given this to us to use at will and whatever we want, but we are to be good stewards of this. We have to take care of these ecosystems, the environment, the animals, the plants, all of it. That still puts us, however, above the earth. And so there are feminist theologians and scholars who will say we need to move now away from the stewardship model to a more egalitarian model that doesn't take speciesism into account, that sees us all as equals, all deserving together, and not some sort of hierarchy. So that's really, in some ways you could see this in conversation with the dominion theologies of early in the Hebrew Bible, and saying, no, all these hierarchies and structures, those stories don't work for us anymore.
You know, too often they're going to churches and they're being taught that, you know, the men are their providers, and, you know, the men are the head, and, you know, there's God and man and then woman, and that's so devaluing. That is absolutely so devaluing, that having some way to go in there and say no, you know, if you want to have a relationship with God, you can just have a relationship with God. You don't need a man to do that. You can have that. You can be empowered to have that connection on your own. And I don't want to throw it on, you know, men are bad. Yeah, but I think too that in the society that we're living in, the society that we're trying to function in, there's also a lot of pressure put on men, that they have to be at the absolute top of that pinnacle. They have to be the ones that are providers. They have to be protectors. There's so many things that are put on men in this structure as well, that it nurtures an abusive mentality. That if men are expected to be manly men, it nurtures them to be tough and not be nurturing, and the whole system is just broken. It's, you know, it stinks for men, for women, for animals. There has to be some way to realize that you know, compassion is needed in all relationships. That compassion, you know, I don't care if you have a hamster. You need to be compassionate towards the needs of that hamster. You know, it's a life. It's, you know, and life, all life has rights, but we don't think about that. We don't look at that. We don't. It's too disposable. Everything is too disposable.
Pets are often presented as adoring and adorable sidekicks to human lives, rather than individuals with their own interests and behaviors that have nothing to do with us.
I guess it was this sense that I had from a very early age that, like, we humans aren't the whole picture. Like, which was not like necessarily common. It wasn't the way I was brought up. My parents were more conventional in the sense that like, you know, there wasn't a lot of discussion about animal rights and things like that. But when I first learned about it, when I was probably preteen, it just made so much sense to me. It clicked that like, yeah, it's not just human rights. There's all these other species out there. So it was just a part of my mental, makeup, even though I'm not quite sure where it came from originally. Yeah, so actually, I mean, I found my way to Buddhism because, like so many people in this country who find their way to Buddhism, I said, like, I'm suffering. I'm going through mental suffering, and I'm not quite sure how to deal with it. And so I started to do meditation and learn more about Buddhism. And at first I was really drawn to like the idea like all sentient beings are part of the landscape, not just humans. Like humans don't have dominion over anything in Buddhism, you know.
I am a big believer in the idea that if we're not taking care of the most vulnerable beings among us, we are not doing our work. As humans, I remember in college coming to this realization that, you know, if God doesn't exist, we need to be God for one another, meaning we need to step in and care for one another. And to me, that has always pushed me, that idea that I have has always sort of pushed me toward the most vulnerable people. And that extends to not just human animals, but non-human animals. Animals bear the burden of so much of our own brokenness as human beings.
I think we could do better there. I think we could do better understanding the human problems in our community and seeing how the human problems contribute to the animal problems. I think they're fairly siloed and they're interconnected. You know, those people who got evicted would probably still have their dog if they still had their house.
The predominance of middle-class white women is in essence a marker of privilege. I have the ability to spend a lot of time volunteering here because I have so much autonomy in the rest of my life. I mean, I work full time, but I set my hours. I, can work from home, even though I work for, a large institution. I have that freedom. A lot of people, a lot of women that volunteer here are retired, or they don't even need to work because they have a spouse, usually a husband, who's bringing in the money. So the predominance of women can be, in some cases, a marker of like the privilege to be able to volunteer to help animals.
There are women of color who volunteer here, but it is a much smaller percentage of people, and I always wish it was different. I don't think that when it comes to liberation, we're ever really going to understand unless we're not really going to make a dent if it's just white people doing this work. White middle-class women don't know what it's like not to be a white middle-class woman. You have to work really hard in our society to know that. You have to look for it. And you'll never really know, but I mean, you can live your whole life. As a white middle-class woman, I could live my whole life and not really ever have to think that hard outside my bubble of experience. And so I think a lot of times, when you're talking about why animals end up here, and a lot of that is a function of poverty, and we're in the southeastern United States in a segregated city. We are stratified by race. That doesn't mean there aren't poor white people. That does not mean there aren't, well-to-do, successful, educated African Americans, because there absolutely are. But by and large, when you're talking about cruelty seizures and, animals being brought in that are in medical need because somebody ran out of money, a lot of times, not all the time, but because if you look at how the poverty numbers break down and how unequal our society is, it's also very unequal by race. Just looking at the black-white wealth gap, all of that kind of stuff. So a lot of times, even though nobody's really saying it, and they're not saying it usually, I always wonder, we're obviously missing something really big here. You know, white middle class women can't fix a problem that affects a whole lot more than just white middle class women.
The budgeting department of Guilford County has mapped out where the largest number of calls come for animal control. And sure enough, those red areas on the map are the impoverished areas and the high minority areas. So teaching these kids that these animals have feelings a lot of time is such an eye-opener, because a lot of these kids know dog fighters. And realizing that this dog most often did it because he loved the person that put him in the ring. That this dog, was hurt, was crying. That essentially is torture. Getting them to understand that, getting them to see that animals aren't things can make a huge improvement in their lives. When we get into talk about spay and neuter and unwanted puppies and unwanted kittens, too many girls in this area, their value is in how they look, not their grades. And becoming a baby mama. That's something they strive for. It's not an accident a lot of times, it's what they strive for, that they want to have a baby. And most of the time, why do they want to have a baby? Is because they want to be loved, they want to be valued, they want a sense of worth. And what a terrible reason to have a baby. What a terrible way to look at yourself. That you should be able to celebrate who you are and not have to fall into that trap. And I think a lot of that comes about when we talk about the euthanasia rates, having puppies, the unwanted animals, how they feel, and trying to make these kids, particularly these young girls, understand that they have in their lives the power to do something about this problem, can also empower them to realize that they can do so much more.
There's so much more we need to do as a society. And the way I can start doing that is I can help them.
I think animal advocacy work can certainly be feminist, just as in any sort of activism can be feminist if it's done purposefully with feminist ideals in mind, which tends to be an elimination of hierarchy, a more horizontal structure as opposed to a vertical one. Ideally one that's intersectional and that listens to all voices and isn't just about an authority in the room putting forth ideas. So I think most things can be made feminist with intention. And I certainly think animal advocacy work can do that.
Like, I kind of bring my same academic, intellectual skill set to the work I do, to some of the work I do here. Like, what's the most effective way to reach out to get more volunteers? what kind of literature do we need to display out here that's most needed by the public? Like, so that like kind of research mindset, like I do use it here. But there's definitely a way in which my work here taps into a part of me that my academic work doesn't come close to. And that's my heart. I mean, I love the people I work with, I love the work I do, but it's very intellectual. I'm not a clinician, I'm a PhD researcher. So the work is totally head-based. And when I come here, like, it's just a real connection with people, with the animals, that's not solely heart-based, but it's very heart-based. I mean, I still use my head here, but I mean, so in that way, like, you know, I get far more out of this than I give, you know, because it develops this part of me. I don't have children. There was never a time in my life where I felt a strong maternal instinct to have children. It fit also with my environmental ethic. Like, you know, Carol Adams had this line, whatever, she said, like, I just knew from an early age that I wanted to walk as lightly on the earth as possible. And I've known that too. And for me, walking lightly has been, I'm not going to reproduce. So I think for a lot of people, like, that heart connection comes, like, with children. And for me, it comes in a place like this. And it's not just with the animals, it's with the people too. Like, I connect with people who care about animals and want to help them, and like, that's my tribe.
Animal advocacy has absolutely saved my life. It helps me avoid despair about all the suffering that I know is out there in the world. And I know my efforts are really modest contributions to a more humane world, but I found that at least trying to help is so much more comforting than doing nothing.
Like I said, for myself, it literally saved my life. I've never been suicidal, except for that point in my life when, you know, my health was bad, I couldn't work, I had no income, and, you know, I'm getting a little emotional. And, you know, you come here and the dogs love you anyway. It doesn't matter. It absolutely does not matter. And then you start looking at the way that they're treated and how, you know, they have nothing but us. They have nothing but those of us who, you know, come here and feed them and love them and care for them. And they're happy. You know, their lives are so miserable. A lot of them are they're beaten, they're abused, they're neglected, and all they want to do is crawl on your lap and kiss you. They enable you to realize that, you know, the past is the past. It happened, it's done, it's over with. Let's keep going. Let's just roll up our sleeves and trudge on and keep going. And that's very empowering. It's a very, very empowering feeling when you realize that I can't change the past. I can't do anything about anything that happened in the past. But I can do something right now. And that's a very empowering feeling, a very strong feeling. You carry that into all areas of your life from there. A lot of times it seems like this is where you can claim your power. Was so much going on in people's personal lives as well as the world. A way to claim your power is to take care of this abused dog, which, I mean, is a wonderful thing. I think everyone has to find a way to claim their power, to be able to speak up and right wrongs. And I think even with starting with animal advocacy, you know, again, going back to the hierarchy of, you know, men, women, children, animals, if you start pulling up from here, it's going to raise the rest as well.
No, I didn't say kangaroo. Good paw, buddy. That's a good paw. That's a good paw, buddy. Yes, it is. That's a good boy. That's a good boy.
When women are empowered to stop the abuse, to work against having wonderful, healthy dogs euthanized, they're putting their line in the sand. They're saying no more, no more. This can't happen anymore. You can't abuse anymore, and that doesn't stop with animals. That's wrong. You cannot abuse anymore. You cannot, minimize the worth of a life.
Oh, you knucklehead. You big knucklehead. Not quite. Yeah. Not quite. Yes, you are, sweet baby.
And I do have hope. I have a lot of hope. I've got 2 granddaughters, getting ready to have 3 granddaughters and a grandson. And I think their world is going to be far better than mine.
What's he got?